I'm hoping that what's going to now follow from Frank's presentation is going to keep you equally engaged in different ways, in multiple and different ways, because everybody is going to be talking about different things and talking about them in different ways as well. We had Frank's wonderful presentation where he kind of just stood there and told us stories, and for some of us and our students, it's their first time presenting today. So it's the first time I've really talked about some of my PhD stuff, so I am really going to go through following my notes. So, but I hope that there's something useful and thought-provoking in it for you. So what I'm going to present today draws, am I turned on? Yeah. Draws on the, I'm just going to stay here because I'm trying not to move the microphone. Draws on the work from my recently completed, as Judy said, PhD, which is in the field of counsellor education. So that's my focus. I think it's equally applicable to people working as counsellors, but my focus really is on counsellors in training. So limited research is available which directly investigates the lived experience of counsellors in training and how it shapes both what it means to become a counsellor and counsellor education. As a counsellor educator here on a Master of Counselling program espousing a social constructionist approach to counselling, I was interested to both study the lived experience of counsellors in training and explore the possibilities of theorising this process and their experience beyond the limits of available, typically humanistic conceptual frameworks for counsellor education. So my thesis performs an experiment in thinking what's called posthumanist theory, which I'll introduce you to. See, Nadia smiling because she's read it. I'll introduce you to that a little bit. So with the data generated from a diverse group of 8 counsellor and training participants using the methodology of collective biography, which involved, that was us meeting as a group in this room over the course of a year. So my focus on the field of counsellor education and my engagement with this post-human turn has led to a necessary rethinking or reconfiguring of what I call a post-human counsellor and training subject formation. So the shaping, this is the process, the shaping of a counsellor. And so the ongoing shaping of a counsellor's lived experience in the counselling room. We've just talked a lot about the client and the diagram that Frank showed as well, looking at all of the multiple factors that are impacting on the client outcome. So I'm looking here now at the counsellor and what are all the forces that are actually shaping the experience, the lived experience of the counsellor and how they're relating to the client. So a post-humanist analytic focus enabled me to engage in a mapping of these multiple, entangled, material, affective and discursive forced relations enacting the agental possibilities for counsellors in training. So this process, for me, this methodological process I'm talking about, facilitated what I called a decentering of the individual subject, a decentering of the individual, and instead in the data it invited an opening up to interactive flows, to matter, and I'll talk about tears. Tears is matter, tears is what came to matter in my data analysis, and material discursive practices. So what then emerged was how tears, crying, but particularly the matter of tears, came to matter for counsellors in training in relation to the multiple forces producing them in the counselling encounter. There's very little work on tears, counsellor tears. There's a little bit on, well, probably quite a bit more on client tears and how we might interpret them and respond to them. But there's some work that's just being started now to look at actually counsellor tears. There's a lot more on actually the tears of doctors even, and what happens and what that means in relationship with their patients. Surprisingly, very little in counselling. So it's a small piece of this work that I want to present today. So one of the questions that I asked was, why do we need this? Why do we need to reconceptualise this subject of counsellor education? So I would say that there's a lack of current relevant research. So recent commentary in the counselling and psychotherapy literature on the lived experience of counsellors in training continues to emphasise the need to learn more about their experiences and the challenges that counsellors encounter during their training years. It's also suggested that the theory and practice on training novice, what are called novice therapists, is fairly outdated, and there's very little scholarly work which is focused on conceptualising the learning and training environment in regard to counsellor preparation programs. Also, there's the suggestion that there's actually high levels of stress during this period of education. It's suggested that while researchers struggle to grasp the complexities and processes involved in the development of new counsellors, many students in such training programs experience potentially negative impacts, such as a sense of incompetence, confusion, increased anxiety, and even burnout. And all of these things, are risks for counsellors in their ongoing work as well. So the inevitability of stress that surrounds such training programs has been questioned, and the issue raised as to whether such programs expose trainees to unacceptable stress levels while simultaneously promoting high levels of vulnerability and openness to experience. So third, it's also been suggested that the study of psychotherapies has been favoured over the study of psychotherapists. So the resulting lack of research is due in part to this implicit bias in thinking about therapy basically as a set of methods, techniques or procedures that are effective in and of themselves, which Frank talked about as well, that tiny little bit that is actually about the method. So there is this myth that therapists, when properly trained, are more or less interchangeable, which I don't think is something that any of us would agree with. So connected to this, researchers and counsellor educators have criticised the field for emphasising technique and training of skills over other important aspects of counsellor and therapist development, such as relationship quality and the person of the counsellor or therapist. Again, I think it fits nicely with what Frank was talking about. So this shift in thinking away from the primary emphasis in counsellor education as skills training becomes more relevant in light of the ongoing research into factors which influence client outcomes. So as Frank again talked about, there's this growing significant body of evidence that it's this shared group of factors, one of which is emphasising the collaborative relational work of therapist and client, which are significant to contributing to positive client change, which is actually that. So some of those same references there as well. So what this means is that if much of the variability of client outcome in counselling and therapy is attributable to the potency of the client, the therapist and therapeutic alliance, rather than the choice of therapeutic approach. So despite, however, the numbers, percentages and large body of research attempting to quantify such a process, these factors are not invariant, they're not proportionally fixed or neatly additive. Rather, they might be better described as interdependent, fluid and dynamic in a reciprocal, contextual, relational therapeutic process. So given this emerging understanding, who is this educative subject at the heart of counsellor education was one of my questions. If we know education then is about more than imparting knowledge and skills training and counselling techniques, and if we know we're educating counsellors to be equipped to respond to a personal professional relationship where multiple fluid, dynamic, complex factors interact and influence processes of change and outcomes for clients, then the question arises, how do we conceptualise this educative subject? How do we conceptualise the counsellor? And in turn, the process of counsellor education and its educators. So for me, that was a primary question, who am I as an educator and what am I educating for and how do I do that and who am I educating? So currently the predominant subject in the literature of counsellor education is what's known as the humanist subject. So this is a counsellor in training whose being as a self-contained, self-reflective human subject, which will be familiar to everybody. But that self is taken for granted in that they are typically a-theorised. So this individual's experience, development and identity is situated within a particular humanistic, psychological and phenomenological framework. And in this is an identity which is considered to be universal, as existing within the individual. It's unified, stable, self-contained and developed through an internal or intrapsychic process across time and experience. social constructionist view would contest that and think that individual differently, but in terms of counsellor education literature, there's very little even from that perspective. So while such humanistic conceptualisations represented important philosophical shifts, they've nevertheless come to be seen as limited in contemporary thinking around identity. Such humanistic accounts of experience, development and identity have resulted in difference such as gender, race, ethnicity, being made invisible. In particular, relations of power and oppression inscribed inside the practices taken to be universal have been ignored. So finally, just in considering this need to reconceptualise the counsellor as subject in counsellor education, my aim, I turned to posthumanism. So I'll just kind of throw out a couple of ideas around that. So Rosie Braidotti states that we are experiencing at present an explosion of scholarship on non-human, inhuman and post-human issues. She says the post-human predicament in a world of fast-moving technological advances and also of contemporary political developments in relation to economic globalisation, the war on terror and the Earth's changing ecosystem, enforces the necessity to think again and to think harder about the status of human subjectivity and the ethical relations, norms and values that may be worthy of the complexity of our times. Also, John Winslade suggests in relation to therapeutic practice that it has to continually reinvent itself and redescribe itself in order to stay relevant and vital, and that it must seek out the most sophisticated analyses of what is happening in the world in which we live and work today. And I propose the same for the field of counsellor education and for reconsidering who the counsellor is that we are training for the world that we're currently living in. So posthumanism invites us to rethink power, matter and meaning as intra-active, as entangled, dynamic, co-constitutive networks of relations that structure our being human. And I think that the diagram that Frank put up, that second diagram, which was much more dynamic, much more interconnected than that first sort of pie chart, starts to speak to this notion. So I'm not sure if I just said this, it reconfigures the nature-culture binary with a return to the agency of matter, of the body, and of the material world. And this entails rethinking post-human identity formations. According to Braidotti, human subjectivity, the lived experience that we all have as individuals, in this complex field of forces has to be redefined as an expanded relational self. She describes this new ontology as a regrounding of subjects and the radical immanence of their embodied and embedded locations. So we are embodying the embedded locations that we are within the world. This is a complex vision of a subject as an individual produced within a materialist process ontology, with special emphasis on the embedded and the embodied, the affective and relational structure of subjectivity, of our lived experience. So as Karen Barad and Rosie Braidotti remind us, who were two key thinkers in developing this sort of theoretical approach, this is always an ethical post-human becoming. Braidotti describes a post-human ethical imagination in the form of ontological relationality, which stresses an enlarged sense of interconnection between self and others, and between self and the world. And this is Barad's notion of intra-action rather than interaction. So, as I said, through the process of data analysis, what came to matter in surprising in multiple ways through in my research were counsellor and training tiers, conceptualised in Barad's agental realist terms as material discursive practices or interactive phenomena. So such analysis enabled me to bring forth not just the complex and interactive forces at work in producing tiers, but through tiers, the forces at work then in this ongoing shaping of counsellor in training subjectivities, influencing what is actually happening in the counselling room. So these are the multiple and often invisible forces that are at play in counselling encounters. So this detailed mapping of the presence and what I call the present absence or ghostly presence of tears, as talked about by research participants in the collective biography groups, opened up a multiplicity of otherwise invisible material, relational, social and cultural forces interacting to produce tears. So it's going very much beyond tears simply as an emotional response to something in the moment. I think that our experience is much more complex than that. So I want to turn to an example of one of the many interactive forces that emerged in an analysis of the production of ghostly tears. Tears that are present within the body but not visible on the face. And the force that I want to talk about today is neoliberalism. So briefly, neoliberalism as political ideology can be described as a pervasive, invasive, and yet often visible encroachment across multiple spaces in the lives of individuals. Briefly, very briefly, under the social and political order of neoliberalism, which you would have heard particularly in the media lately if you follow politics, emerging over the last 30 to 40 years in New Zealand and across the Western world, where both government and society have taken up as their primary concern their relationship with the economy, in contrast to previous concerns which also encompassed broader social, collective and societal welfare and well-being. So under neoliberalism, subjects are produced as free to be able to affect the success of their own individual lives through rational decision-making practices. Equivalently though, those who are less productive, less successful economic entrepreneurs in society are recorded failure on the basis of their own individual poor decisions and choices. Schools and universities are argued to play significant roles in producing such highly individualised, responsibilised citizens. And I know that Mika is going to talk about neoliberalism as well, which will be great. So ghostly tears. Ghostly tears refer, from my perspective, to an entanglement of tears manifest as absent in their physical form, yet as potently present in minds and bodies. And a mapping of these present absent tears required attention to things less easily visible or tangible, but which nevertheless have real and ongoing lives and effects. So the following excerpt that I'm going to share comes from one counsellor in training, who I call Bailey, talking in the collective biography groups about the presence and causes of her own ghostly tears in a counselling encounter with a student in a high school. Just sort of taking the tiniest little bit just to give you an idea of that. So she says, I almost wanted to cry because I thought, how on earth did she deal with this? It was like a shock of hearing everything she was saying, and it was also, what can I do? Because my days are so flat out, seeing between 5 and 8 or 9 kids a day. I know that I have to slow down, and it's not like the school's telling me to do it. It's like I've got this thing in me where I keep thinking I need to, because they're all lining up outside my door. I need to be there for them. And I need to give them the space and time. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. So taking just neoliberalism as a force to think about this, I suggest there's at least 3 ways in which it is operating in this counselling encounter to interactively produce the nearness of tears for Bailey's counsellor subjectivity. So neoliberalism's ideology is recognisable as being alive in her body. It's like I've got this thing in me, she says. She doesn't know what it is. It is in the powerlessness that results from her overwhelming sense of individual responsibility for the job of fixing the problems of the students she works with, while at the same time knowing she cannot affect the fixes that she might wish to see. It's recognisable in the flat-out days of seeing up to 9 kids in a day, and the increasing demands to be more productive in less time, and in the inevitable individual responsibility that she feels to meet or fail to meet those demands due to the invisibility of neoliberalism's grip on our workplaces and our lives. It's recognisable in the increasing, in particular, Where am I up to? In the increasing and particular demands placed on her as a school counsellor from working with students faced with the effects of living and surviving in the challenges of today's world, including especially those of neoliberalism. These effects can all be said to be potentially heightened, firstly through neoliberalism's wide-reaching influence in the context and curriculum of high schools, as early targets of neoliberal ideology, and secondly, operating through the discipline of counselling, which as a psychotherapy has been argued as a technology of subjectivity seen to most fully epitomise the logic of neoliberal subjectivity, which is up for debate, but I think it's an interesting point. It's an interactive co-constitution of these forces, these neoliberal forces, alongside other ones, through which Bailey's tears and her counsellor's subjectivity, the possibilities for how she can respond, are produced. So as I state above Bailey's words, it's like I've got this thing in me, seem to speak directly to what Jean McAvoy describes as the uptake of ideology through the subjectified body, the reproductions of macro ideologies and local, relational, intersubjective interaction. But what is this thing? And how is its force enacted in Bailey's subjectified body? She suggests that it produces a number of compulsions, including a need to be there for the students lining up outside her door, seeing between 5 and 8 or 9 kids a day, combined with an overwhelming want to fix things, to try to make them better. She locates this thing, this need, this force is situated inside of her, absolving the school in which she is situated from any responsibility, due to what she sees as the absence of any explicit direction from them. It's not like the school's telling me to do it, she says. So the only resolution for managing such overwhelm inevitably also comes to be situated within the realm of her own individual action. I know that I have to slow down, she says. Failing to manage, failing to slow down, failing to meet the overwhelming need in what is actually an unmanageable environment and what are actually unfixable by any one individual social, economic and cultural problems, results in Bailey's sense of individual powerlessness and knowing, as she says, you're not going to be able to fix this. Bailey's ghostly tears and emerging counsellor subjectivity, which are inseparable, cannot be seen as separate from the realities of a market-driven regime of neoliberalism and its effects on individuals, working conditions, institutions, and the very fabric of societies which are governed by such policies. So thinking with Berard's post, that can be quite depressing to think that we're subject to these forces. Thinking with Berard's posthumanist framework also necessitates attention to space and time. Time is reconfigured. This reconfiguring of time becomes an essential component of the way neoliberalism comes to matter in the production of her tears and in the production of counsellor bodies. Neoliberalism's insistence on individual productivity, on outcomes, on metrics, is a strong force enacting a shift in the configuration of time. Time interacts with neoliberalism and is felt differently in bodies. It speeds up and the effects of this have and are having potentially dangerous effects for the counselling profession, both for counsellors and clients. Bailey speaks of needing to give the long line of clients wanting to see her space and time. But where does this come from? When in the same moment she needs to slow down, to move more slowly through time. So time is reconfigured as being scarce in a school counselling office, with potentially endless and increasing need, situated in an institution and society permeated by values of productivity measured in metrics. The more clients you're able to see, the more productive you're being. And yet productivity requires measurable outcomes, as Bailey says, a requirement to fix things. So time is reconfigured as a scarce resource and at the same time as extremely valuable. Every minute counts and must be made to count. So neoliberal time is potent and its effects in producing subjects on the edge of tears, on the edge of failure are apparent. The possibilities for slowing down, for reconfiguring time beyond neoliberal time appear challenging and necessary. So we'll come back to that, but that was just one of the forces that in my analysis of tears became important. So you can't actually see it, but this is in the shape of a tear. And so there were all of these forces interacting that came together. You know, it's a relational process. So people's personal histories, empathy, gender, ethnicity, ethics, all of these things actually that often we're so busy thinking about what we're doing in the next question that we're going to ask that we're not actually recognising all of these things that are impacting on what can happen in this encounter. And making time to slow down and do that can open up other possibilities for how we can respond. So this kind of analysis aims to show not just the complex and interactive forces at work in the materialisation of tears, but through tears. 25. Is it? Okay. All right. Yeah, okay. So in this way, a counsellor in training, subject, and a counsellor is reimagined as an ethical, vital, moving embodiment of multiple affective material discursive relations, an enactment of unfolding the self onto the world while unfolding the world within. And so the question then becomes, given that, how can we be open and alive to each meeting, each interaction, so that we might use our ability to respond, our responsibility, to help awaken, to breathe life into ever new possibilities for living justly, for helping ourselves to flourish and those in front of us to flourish. Okay. So that's what Karen Berard, whose theory I drew on, asks us. How can we be open and alive to these meetings? So the production of tears, present or ghostly, thus cannot be described just as one individual's emotional response or professional choice. Rather, they might be better described to be responsive entanglements of inseparable ethical, social, material, affective, discursive and political relations. Counselling and counsellor education must keep pace with and do justice to the rapidly changing world and its effects on individuals. Perhaps now more than ever, human subjectivity cannot be separated from this rapid political, technological and cultural shifting landscape. Counsellor education needs to offer adequate conceptualisations of this post-human subject and adequate conceptual tools and maps to equip counsellors to attend to both their own and their clients' intra-active processes of ongoing subjectification in an increasingly complex and changing world. It's by placing our attention on the often invisible forces and entangled events that we are a part of, that inventive potentialities and transformative capacities to act open up, I would suggest, for us as counsellors, for our clients and for counsellor education. Thank you.
Kia ora. Guten Tag. My name is Micha Multaub. I'm a guidance counsellor at Linwood College currently, and I was born in Germany and originally came out here in 1986. I'm married to Amanda, who's out the back there. She's here as my prime support person. And I'm as well a father of 5 grandchildren. I'm going to talk today about my thesis and how that all came about. Self-care in the age of neoliberalism, an autoethnographic exploration by a counsellor. So I did talk in my thesis a lot about the problem. And all you solution-focused people don't probably know what I'm talking about. People love talking about their problems. Anyway, I'm coming to that a bit later. The objective of this presentation is, yes, to keep calm and practice self-care. Not to forget, very important. Also, I want to create more awareness about the need for self-care by informing you how the process of writing a thesis has supported me to emphasize the importance and practice of better self-care. Also, by sharing some of the key aspects in the hope that my audience will consider how reflection and the solution-focused approach may assist their own self-care strategies. And then we hopefully have a little bit of time for some questions. So why write a thesis about exploring self-care? initially, when I started looking into different ideas, it came to me that I wanted to do some research that would do something for myself and assist me in my process of becoming a counselor. I wanted to deal with this project with themes that were very close to my heart, but also assist my development as a counselor. Writing the thesis enabled me to explore some long-held assumptions about the world and myself. In particular, the notion of, can I actually make a difference in a world that I perceive as unjust and sick? I also revisited my past experiences with burnout and my predisposition for work addiction. Yes, I am one. It was at times very uncomfortable, but it was also curious. I was also curious about where it might lead me, the whole process. Just like Shani sort of said, Shani said, I didn't really know where I was going to begin with. So this is just a continuation why I came to this particular theme. You probably all have seen this before. In case of an emergency, you need to first put your own oxygen mask on before you attempt to help others. That's really sort of the central idea of my thesis. And I was the central part of that discovery. So I need to acknowledge that I need to look at my own survival first before I'm able to assist others effectively. Challenge my beliefs that are obstacles to maintaining effective self-care, for instance, being a martyr. To be able to practice self-care in a society that I perceive as promoting self-abuse or even self-destruction. We all know about the digital 24/7 work engagements. And build awareness about states such as burnout, vicarious traumatization, compassion fatigue, and work addiction. So the guiding questions of how I can be helpful to others if I'm compromised provoked a number of additional questions. How do I assemble my beliefs? Why do I acknowledge certain constructs of others? Why am I thinking, feeling, or doing things in a certain way, even if these thoughts and behaviors are not helpful? For instance, not looking after my needs and engaging in work addiction. Can I change some of the unhelpful narratives to support myself and others using the tools that I've learned during my counselling education? So I really wanted to put solution focus as well to the test and using myself as the subject. How does the progression of co-constructed narratives shape who I was and who I am or who I will become? So very important about identity. In brief, I wanted to explore the process of how and why I acknowledge certain constructs that determine my behavior in relation to self-care. And I love this quote here by good old Ludwig, which is, knowledge is in the end based on acknowledgement. So, using a thesis as a reflective process. I didn't really know where I was going with it, as I said. So it was a lot of testing and reading and more testing and asking my wife millions of questions, and she was very patient. I was basically posing as the research subject, recognizing that the personal story is research data, which is closely linked to the autoethnographic methodology, choosing theorists that support the reflective process and conceptualization of solutions, recognizing that the results are fluid, entering renewed cycles of experimentation and reflection in the future, very similar to what Shani has been talking about. This is not the end point, or I'm not arriving somewhere, this is just the beginning, and it's just an ongoing process. For this purpose, I used Dewey's developmental spiral as the underpinning structure, and that looks like that. Yeah. I played around with that a little bit. Using a thesis as a reflective process, and that's pretty much my method here. So using my own personal experience, going into reflection, conceptualization, and then experimentation. You have to imagine a helix rather than a cycle, so it's basically an ongoing process. So I'm going to talk a bit about experience, and we already have been hearing about the neoliberal construct. Self-care as a subjective experience influenced by discourse, and it's not just the neoliberal construct, it's a whole range of other things like my past, and socially constructed by human interactions. And yeah, Krishnamurti is really sort of, is the thing that comes to mind. And of course, this is just my perceived problem. I'm not saying that it's the next person's. So the question that I was asking myself is, am I culpable if I fix people only to be cast back into the fray of a sick society? I mean, really? How do I maintain self-care if my clients and I are re-traumatized by engaging with a system that I perceive as unfair and brutal? What is the historical context of the problem and my adoption of the underlying constructs? Yeah, we already had a little definition for the neoliberal construct. In the 1980s, the social, economic and political environment underwent significant changes when the New Zealand Labour government introduced neoliberal policies as part of a global ideological shift. You probably remember Thatcher, or some of you might remember Thatcher and Reagan. Competitiveness in form of targets was introduced to most institutions, utilizing managerialism in an effort to socially engineer the free market ethos into the work arena. This ethos eventually crept into all aspects of human interactions, resulting in social inequality. And that's what we're dealing with nowadays. I mean, we had a change in government recently, but I think we're still a long, long away from fixing the problem. That's my perception. A little bit more about the theoretical underpinning, which was mainly based on social constructionism. It can be explained as a perspective which postulates that human life and society evolved because of social and interpersonal influences through meaning-making processes utilizing language. And it looks sort of a bit like that. We all got different ideas about even the same issue. Another part of my theoretical exploration was I wanted to know how is knowledge constructed, how do we define validity of research, because of course all the positivistic sort of research would be arguing with me a lot and with my thesis. In research, my research from a subjective vantage point, is it actually valid? How is subjective experience influenced by power structures and vice versa? How does discourse influence interactions between individuals and society, and how does the reverse work? My main theorists were Foucault, Desautour, Derrida and Wittgenstein. And a little bit about the methodology that I used. As mentioned before, autoethnography. I just leave that up to you to have a quick read because I'm running out of steam. Ah, yeah. Yeah, I chose that for obvious reason because it allowed me to really look at my own process and my own story. So the question was, of course, how have powerful discourses in the past influenced my development and behaviors? And I leave again just a short little part of my thesis here for you to read. So very early on, the whole idea of work addiction was embedded. The question was, how did that happen? How have powerful discourses in the past influenced my development and behaviors? This is my hometown after 1945. It was to 87% destroyed, similar to Dresden. And my parents were 13 years of age when they came out of that. So just another little part of that story. And I'll leave it up to you to read that. So you can see that there's a link between what we're experiencing nowadays and what our forefathers have experienced. I actually go in the thesis right back to the colonization of the United States and how work ethic was introduced to the natives in the US. Anyway, now coming to solutions, enough of the problem. Yeah, that's part of the conceptualization and experimentation of the cycle based on Dewey and discovering what works. For me, this model has been doing wonders. I love it. I use it as well in my practice with my kids because it is a very holistic approach to a person's health. It incorporates the whole person, not just the psychological part or just the physical part. It is about the whole person. And you can, especially with kids, it's really nice to use it because what happens if your walls are a little bit wobbly on one side of the house? I'm always asking that question and they come, oh, it will fall down. Yeah. So I highly recommend that as a self-assessment tool as well for your self-care. The other thing that I did in my thesis was to use a number of colleagues that were happy enough to support me to create a transcript based on some solution-focused sessions, and I used that material from these from supervisions, and also incorporated the whole work that I did throughout writing the thesis, and that is part of that transcript that supported me to do, to get to new solutions and new ways of looking after myself. A detailed literature review as well enabled me to read about a wide range of existing research and knowledge about self-care issues. There is actually a lot out there, as well about work addiction. And yeah, I mean, it's all there. We just have to look at it and see what it does to people. For instance, by becoming aware of my tendency to compensate stress and anxieties with work and busyness, which is largely based on my heritage, because that's what the German people did after the war. They just got busy. And I was able to implement practical measures of self-care. My theoretical explorations have helped me to understand how the neoliberal discourse, for instance, influences self-care. Shani has already talked about that. I need to be able to say, no, this is enough, no more. And I have to remember that because the construct is saying something very different. Inspired by the writing of Foucault, I explored the responsibility I have towards my clients to exercise my power wisely. while being aware of what that power does. Because, like you remember the slide earlier on, do I really want to be responsible for throwing them back into the fray? How do I manage that? How do I use that power? Also exploring the theories of Desautor taught me how to practice the practice of mundane everyday tasks and how they can be transformed into unique events that create empowered communities. I can highly recommend Desautor. He's very, very refreshing and very practical as a philosopher. Yes, in summary, writing the thesis created a new narrative that gave me agency and a sense of coping with the neoliberal construct and other problems, and the process had a very positive outcome for me as a person, as a counselor. Yeah, it was helpful. Thank you. Here we go. I forgot about this. I just sort of jotted down a few points that I used in my thesis as well. So maybe just have a read and just see what kind of responses you have to some of those questions. The first part is about creating a departure point from a problem that you perceive. And then the last part is just a few questions, solution-focused questions that you can use as well in your self-assessment.
Yeah, as Shani introduced, I have had a few challenges along the way. I had hoped to finish this at the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, but I had quite a significant skiing accident. But I'm here today, and in terms of my research, and in terms of the university, and I want to personally thank Shani and Judy for being so flexible with everything. Well, I guess my research is quite robust because I've had to pick it up, put it down again, and then have medical hurdles along the way, and pick it up and then put it down again, and then each time I would read it again, and then my supervisors would read it again, and there'll be different comments, different have you considered. I'm going to start quite wide today, and I move around a lot, so that's why I've got this clicker. So we're going to talk a little bit about what e-counselling is, what's out there, my thesis topic, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and wrap up. So about me, currently I'm working at Catapult Employment Services Trust. So I've always had an interest of kind of combining SFBT with face-to-face counselling. So I use, within my practice, I use a bit of SFBT, primarily SFBT actually, a little bit of ACT, mindfulness, some CBT. And I've handed my thesis, yes, completed. So it's currently being marked. So it's in, and what happens, happens, eh? And I've been involved in other well-being projects and other bits and pieces. So where did it all start? So about 8 years ago, so it'd be 2010, I went to a summer camp in the States. And these are all the camp counsellors, and I like that terminology because it makes it sound like there's other connotations to it there. But when I was there, I went to a special needs camp, so people would come from big institutions. Be dropped off on a bus, and then they'll be there for a week. And sometimes that week would be extended if they had nowhere to go to. And these were really sad cases, you know, very institutionalized cases. There I met a guy called Jody. It was my second week at camp, and Jody's was severely autistic. And he was verbal, but he really just didn't want to do anything with me for the whole time. I actually went to the nurse with this, and I was like, what do I do with Jody? I can't. They give you a whole load of notes before the camp has come, saying this is the way that has worked previously, and there was nothing in that box. So I was like, so anyway, so I was really struggling to know what to do with Jody. I mean, he didn't want to engage with any of the others, you know, because he was autistic. So I was like, I really can't do anything. And the nurse was just like, he's just Jody. There's no way. So I don't know how it came about anyway, but we were sitting down, and there was a Scrabble game, right? And I'm dyslexic, so playing Scrabble is not my strength. Anyway, so I decided to get it out, and then Jody starts making these amazing words, you know? And I was like, man, you know? And he started then communicating himself on what he wanted to do, how he wanted to get around. So then we figured out that we write stuff down, and that's how we get to know what to do. And then from being completely at the beginning, just over the week, by the end he gave me a hug. So since then I've always, I guess I focused on getting to know what the client wants, and getting to know in their way how to best meet the client's needs. So, what is e-counselling? So this is a definition. So e-therapy offers individuals access to support that they need anywhere, anytime, and is available through several different platforms. So what are the strengths? This is just a screenshot from the Youthline website, by the way. So a tool from engagement. So to get young people through the door, I guess, or people who haven't necessarily been to counselling previously, especially with kind of male help seeking, I guess. When I used to work at Youthline, doing text counselling, so we used to reply back on the computer, and it really break spoken wrong. It was like, it would break problems down because we would just see it systematically. And for a young person, they're reading it, and they have to be quite strategic because it's only 160 characters. So they have to be like, this is the problem I'm working on right now. Okay, let's go through that. Okay, is there anything you'd like to talk about? Okay, next problem. And it broke it down. Familiar platform over a cell phone. Perceived anonymity, I guess. Accessibility and help seeking. So, just opening up doors, and I don't think this person's particularly, doesn't seem particularly reserved about going, but anyway. So when I was putting this together, I had a real tendency to look up GIFs, so there's quite a few through this presentation, but I am the one before lunch, so I thought I'd keep you engaged. So what are the risks and what are the concerns? So there is within the literature some stuff around increasing technology addiction or access to exposing young people to explicit material, but I don't think that's specifically for e-counselling. It's more like generic things, like you could be researching some homework and come across some porn or something, and so that's not specific to e-counselling. But there's some stuff around safety and assessing safety. Verbal cues. So when we were at Youthline, we used to say the power of the emoji. So to say that this is positive, smiley face. Oh, that sounds sad. Yeah, that kind of thing. So what's out there? So this is a screenshot of Sparks, which is a CBT-based online platform. But there's kind of self-helpy kind of stuff, like Common Ground, which is a mental health foundation youthy website. There's Sparks, there's Depression with Sir John Kerwin. There's a Lowdown, which is kind of like a younger version of depression.org.nz, really. What's out there in terms of like e-counselling stuff? Like 7 Cups is a relative new thing, which I think comes out of the States. But you can register as a practitioner to work on it in New Zealand if you really wanted to. There's Youthline, and Youthline now have online counselling between like 4 and 8, I think. But otherwise they have phone counselling, text counselling, email counselling. And then there's a National Telehealth Service, which came about at the end of 2015 to 2016, which is like a merger of Quitline, Healthline, other bits and pieces. Yeah. And then there's Lifeline, which do also have a text service and primarily phone as well. So this is another one which I actually stumbled across the other day, which is called Wobot, right? So Wobot is a cognitive and behavioural therapy robot. So I had a conversation with Wobot about when I was putting this presentation together. So I'm angry that I left this to the last minute. Keep it as short and specific as you can. Write one of those angry thoughts here. So time management, and it replies back to you. It's just through Facebook Messenger. So, so there you go. So and it learns. So this is things that Wobot claims to do. It claims to track your mood, give you insight, teach you stuff. Be there 24/7, and that be there 24/7 wasn't that great because it decided to text me checking in at 3 o'clock in the morning. So. So needless to say, a Wobot got the delete on my phone, but yeah, and learn from you over time. Yeah. Anyway, and apparently this is research-based and comes out of Stanford University. Yeah, and there's also like self-helpy kind of stuff, mood, like CBT-based mood tracking and that kind of stuff. So let's suggest that many young people find that it is easier to disclose potentially embarrassing topics, e.g. sexuality, online to a therapist than in a face-to-face setting. And that marker is actually marking my thesis. Aha! Research conducted within Kisline, participants felt that the main benefits of online counselling were that they felt more privacy and emotionally safe, whereas with a face-to-face counsellor or telephone counsellor, sorry, this is directly from my thesis, in a different context, they felt more emotionally vulnerable. Participants reported that online chat counselling, email or text counselling was less confronting a therapy approach when compared to traditional forms of counselling. So, and this is a consistent finding across some of the research. So, usually when we're looking at the research in terms of e-counselling, there's two camps. There's the technology is great, yeah, woohoo. And I don't know whether you've seen the cult movie Napoleon Dynamite, but that's from there. And then there's the technology is scary, don't touch it, that kind of thing. So I had a light bulb moment, which is whether I could combine an element of technology with face-to-face therapy. So you get the strengths of accessibility, perceived confidentiality and disclosure of e-therapy, but respecting those real strengths of face-to-face counselling, which is safety, emotional cues, language cues, and so forth. So that's where my thesis title came out of. So keeping up with young people and a changing counselling environment, exploring the use of between-session text messages to support face-to-face counselling. It's the best of both worlds, I guess. And there is next to no literature on SFBT and e-counselling. There's not much at all. So a lot of the literature that I looked at was on homework tasks, which I'll talk about later, and then other e-counselling forms, I guess. And there's a lot of literature within CBT stuff. So this is the recruitment process. So a email was sent, and I got a really good response. I literally put the study poster into the email, and I got 30 respondents in a week. I think it was partly time of year as well, because it was around mock exam, so people were like, ooh, time out of class, I can talk about my stress with a counsellor. And so then that happened, and then students came and went to what I called an expression of interest appointment. So that was just, this is what the research is about, and they got their consent forms for both themselves and their parent or guardian as well, because I was doing it within a school. So it was basically first come, best dressed, I guess, for the return consent form and then starting all the research. So I had to get both the client consent form and the parent guardian consent form before I went any further. And that made up my research sample. So the research was within a co-educational high school within the Canterbury region. It had 1 year 11 female, 2 year 12 females, and 1 year 12 male. There was another person who had to be taken out. So there was originally 5, but it was 4, but because there was one person who was taken out because of safety concerns. This is how it all happened. So I might be able to get the, oh, I can, there we go. So this is research client 1. So they come to the first session. So this is after they've given all their consent forms in. Come to session 1. We have a solution-focused session that we go through, a solution-focused session. And then at the end, when you're doing, when you're talking about homework or between-session tasks, we co-construct between session text messages, right? So I'll talk about it in a minute. And then throughout the week, depending on client preference, we would send out the text 1, 2, 3, and then in the following session, session 2, when we're talking about what's better or between sessions, we have a reflection on how were the text messages, right? And then that's integrated into the co-construction of between session text messages and so forth. The session 4 was primarily more around feedback. So each of the 4 research clients went through 4 sessions. Is that clear as mud? Cool. Cool. So the research design was a thematic qualitative analysis. So it was my presentation on my results was in kind of 2 parts. The first part was how I co-constructed the text messages. So client during the co-construction process said this. So therefore the text messages that were sent out was this, if that makes sense. So I went through week by week, the participants' language, the use of strengths-based content, and promoting participant agency. So that's was my headings. And then the second part was the feedback that I received, and those were put into themes. So promoting participant agency, use of participants' language, between session positivity, and normalizing counselling conversations. This is a bit, it's not that clear on there, it's clearer on here, but so this is an example transcript and it is pretty lengthy, so this just shows what I said and what the participant responded and so forth for me to get the text message in the end. So this one is basically talking about stuff around music and wanting to talk to their teacher about a particular exam that was going on. This is continued. So all of this was about involving the client through the whole process of this co-construction. So for example, and what time of day would be good for you, preferably not in the evening. So we're talking about 3 or 4. So it's really including the client throughout that process. And so example text message that was sent was, hey, a bit of practice on the music website might make you feel a bit better about talking to your music teacher. So that was what was sent through the week. One of those text messages was sent through the week. These are some other examples was from other clients as well. What will close people notice to you when you're involved in the theatre? It's important to remember the success that you've had with those conversations you had at the movies. You can do it. It's important to remember those important relationships you have. And interestingly enough, for one client, it was enough just to send options. At the beginning of the research, it was a lot more lengthy, and by the end, options was enough to remind the client of her preferred future or her between-session task. So, participant feedback. So, this, I mean, you can, the one I like the best is B. So, one thing about the text messages is that, sorry, I'll rephrase. One thing about the text that is really good is that you always know before each session that you'll have something to talk about. Particularly with an outside school counsellor I would go into the session and would have to try and like think up something. Try and really think really hard. What's bothering me? What do I need to talk about? That's why having those text messages was great, as it immediately would spark a thought so that you can remember the text, you can look at the text and walk into session and be like, I have this to fall back on if needed. So, use of participants' language. Some examples of that was, I like the fact that it was focused and pinpointed and from things on the actual session that you had. And in that way reminded you of the session and what you talked about. Nice that they were all different and not carbon copies. Between session positivity. It was helpful, it was nice, yeah, it was always good to be reminded myself of those kind of things. Yeah, it was pretty good last week with all that positive self-talk. And this is the key theme that came up really throughout all of it, was normalizing counselling conversations. And I'm quite a big advocate for men's health particularly, and I think this one is really, really interesting, seeing that men are like half as likely to go and see a counsellor as a female. So I think there's something to work with on this. So it made conversations around counselling easier. I sometimes was hanging with friends and got a text. They would like ask, you were right, and I could say, yeah. I got this cool text from my counsellor, and this is what we're trialling. Then I could talk about it to them about it. It was good because it acted as a prompt. It kind of makes it easier to talk about those types of things to people, because I don't think that counselling or mental health conversations should be taboo. So some really interesting things came up. I spent, well, the majority of my results section, I really wanted to put a huge amount of onus on the participant's voice. So there's quite a lot of excerpts of what the participant's saying. Take-home messages. I don't know how we're doing for time, but okay, cool, nice. We can have some time for questions. I guess the majority of you are practitioners or are learning counselling, I guess. Key kind of take-home messages is there is evidence that the use of technology can sit well alongside face-to-face SFBT counselling. There is evidence to support the use of co-construction of text messages to increase the helpfulness for clients of using between-session tasks in their counselling, and potential to normalise counselling conversations and thus, I don't know, thus decrease help-seeking. I don't know what I was thinking there, but yeah. Considerations of practice. One thing that came out was when I was sending out the text messages, and I did partly have a little bit of an accident partway through, I guess, but was the idea of burnout. Because although these text messages were co-constructed, I would still have to go back to my notes, figure out what the text message was, and then be like, okay, right, so client A wants it at 4 o'clock. Client B wants it at 5 o'clock. Oh crap, I have this on. Or and it was, because it was non-automated, it had quite a big impact on what I was doing. And as a small scale, it was only for 4 clients, but if it was made bigger to be more robust, I guess, then that would have to be a consideration, right? And then balancing that with the key feedback that was that they liked that it was non-automated and that it was individual. So there's a real balance there, right? So you mean you could make it, you could make it more automated and sent out at exactly 4 o'clock each day or 5 o'clock or whatever, but then you lose that personal connection, I guess, and reflection of the session. And then there's also the general thing of increasing client dependency on technology. So I gather that these slides might be shared. So there's some e-resources that you can utilise if you want. I don't particularly agree with the Wobot, so just please don't give any clients Wobot, but it was just an example. But it is quite scary, and I think it is important as practitioners to really figure out where you are on the spectrum, you know? I'm quite into technology, but, there's some things that do worry me about, potentially around, Wobot, what is that doing, online, potentially vulnerable people, and that's increasing dependency and all those kind of things. Yeah. So, questions?
2 old trees with different shapes and ways of developing and growing, both with extensive roots, meeting and working together. My study was about such a meeting between an experienced counsellor and her supervisor. I have chosen to share a little bit of my research study, the rationale for doing the study, and a brief introduction to the methodology that I used. and especially how I used mind maps to analyze the data. And I also want to share a few of the findings from the study, and I hope that you will find some of them interesting. And if I have time to do that, I will finish with a brief summary of my conclusive thoughts. If we don't have time for that, that's actually okay. I started my journey into this field of work as a practicing social worker in Denmark. And this quote from Means are very familiar to me in my experience of supervision before I came here and became a part of the counseling profession. A counseling profession that do have a high level of attention and value to supervision, and I do think that we should be proud of that. The requirements, recommendations, and expectations to counseling supervision in New Zealand supports this and makes it very interesting to study counseling supervision, especially in this country. Research is quite limited in relation to supervision practices on long term. And recommendations for further research on solution-focused supervision combined with a gap in literature involving experienced practitioners are key elements which have informed my research and have initiated this examination that I have done. Research has not addressed the way in which solution-focused supervision supports counsellor in their continued development. So the purpose of this study was to explore whether and how experienced counsellors find solution-focused supervision meets their needs for clinical supervision. Based on literature and all the literature about clinical supervision, solution-focused brief therapy, solution-focused supervision, and especially on research on solution-focused supervision. And for the purpose of this study, I defined solution-focused supervision the way I saw it. Solution-focused supervision, I've made it easy to you. If you don't bother to read all of it, you can just read the highlighted ones. It will be okay. Solution-focused supervision has the same frame and aims as any kind of counseling supervision, of securing safety and welfare for both the client and the counsellor, and for supporting continued professional growth and development of the counsellor. But solution-focused supervision is supervision where the supervisor works from a solution-focused approach. It's pragmatic, and it will be a professional collaborative conversation based on the supervisee's goals and preferred future. Solution-focused supervision is based on the solution-focused assumptions and will use techniques from solution-focused brief therapy, focusing on what already works and how to do more of that. I also developed the research question by reading literature, and the described gap that I just mentioned inspired me to do this. Being a trainee counsellor motivated me to be curious and explorative about the nature and the effect of solution-focused supervision. I did focus on exploring in what ways and how solution-focused supervision worked for the participants in their daily practice, what elements of solution-focused supervision made a difference for them, and also on describing the role and the content of solution-focused supervision. So, the research question, that was that one. So the research question in the study was, how does solution-focused supervision respond to the needs of experienced counsellors in clinical supervision? The study is grounded in social constructionism, and I have chosen a qualitative research methodology aiming to develop an understanding of how solution-focused supervision is useful. I wanted to collect rich information from supervision practice. I wanted to observe the real world while trying to make sense of it, and the way it is understood by the people participating in it, and in this case, experienced counsellors, and their way of experience and supervision that is based on a solution-focused approach. I intended to describe the participants' way of understanding, to uncover potential patterns in their understanding, and to produce a detailed and practice-based description. I have been as transparent as it was possible for me to be about my influence as the researcher, my worldview and my background. Yeah. 6 experienced counselors have participated in this study. They have between 14 and 32 years of experience, and I guess I can call them quite experienced, without lying. They work, as you can see, in a variety of settings, so it's actually very much a cross-section of counseling work that is described here. I have not included any specific data about age, ethnicity, or education, because given the relatively small number of practitioners engaged in solution-focused work in New Zealand, that information would clearly risk that a lot of you sitting here would know who they were. So I had to not do that. The primary factor for recruitment was at least 10 years of counseling practice and a current engagement in supervision substantially based on a solution-focused approach, with the solution-focused assumptions and core beliefs as a significant aspect in the supervision. 2 of the participants described themselves as described that they used a solution-focused approach exclusively in their work, while 4 of them took an integrated approach, incorporating the solution-focused approach. And the participants described that their supervisors included 2 using solution-focused methods exclusively in their supervision practice, and 4 who worked with a solution-focused approach as a substantial aspect in their integrated approach. The interviews were conducted as semi-structured interviews and performed with an open mind and true to a solution-focused stance. That was an interview approach chosen to gather detailed and descriptive data and to allow the participants to contribute what they found important. I had an intention to work from a flexible approach, to add some reflexive dimensions in the interviews and listen from a stance of not knowing, to find things that I might not have expected to find. The interviews became a conversation and a co-constructed social interaction rather than a question and answer in exchange. The interview approach definitely influenced the data gathering to become much more open and not extremely structured, and at the same time it gave the participants the main voice. I decided to group my interview guide into 2 parts. The first part had a focus on a recent solution-focused supervision session with a purpose to gather details about how solution-focused supervision was used and worked for them. This part also intended to collect data about how solution-focused supervision supported their learning and growth. The second part of the interview guide focused on the long-term experience of solution-focused supervision. I wanted to explore how solution-focused supervision influenced the participants' counseling practice and their client work, to explore how solution-focused supervision might be connected to the participants' professional development, and to incorporate a critical view on whether a solution-focused approach used in counseling supervision could have some limitations. I won't say much about that today. To explore how the participants experienced their individually defined needs for clinical supervision, I asked for their best hopes from participating in solution-focused supervision. This question resulted in a personal description of how they saw their needs for supervision, but clearly described a shared goal of being the best counselor possible and to ensure safe, ethical, and effective practice. They also highlighted that their needs for clinical supervision were connected to their professional learning and development. The participant emphasized the importance securing their well-being and supporting their self-awareness. Linked a little bit to the rest of what we heard before lunch. The influence of our solution-focused approach was very evident already here. A solution-focused language and way of thinking were present in the descriptions of their goals and expectations, focusing on the client's preferred future, what was done well, and what to do more of and differently, as you can see on the mind map. Based on the best hopes and informed by literature, I defined the needs of experienced counselors for supervision as the thing stated over here: to secure safe, ethical, and effective professional counseling practice, to foster learning and growth, and professional development, and to supply restorative support. I chose to use thematic analysis because it is a method that can help make meaning of the data and to manage volume and complexity of a data set without losing the context. I chose thematic analysis to capture what was said in the interview and to support my interpretation. And I chose an inductive approach because I wanted to explore the participants' experience of solution-focused supervision. I wanted to generate meaning from the data and to observe and identify the patterns. And I wanted to learn from experience without preconceptions. I was aware that my interpretation of what was interesting and important was highly shaped by my worldview and the selected methodology, and also by my research question. My analysis was done in 4 phases: familiarizing myself with the data, producing initial themes, and searching for and defining themes based on a decision of what was significant and provided answers to the research question. And I finally selected extracts from the data to produce a report. And one of the things I want to share with you is one thing that I did a little bit special, I think. I used mind maps to complete the thematic analysis phases, to organize and structure, and to systematize the collected data. A mind map, you just saw one, it is a diagram that can be used to organize information visually. But here it's not only used to organize, here it's also used as an analytic tool. The mind maps made the data easily traceable because the data were coded in colors related to each participant and included precise time information about where in the interview it was set, which made it easy for me to return and hear the statement again if I needed to. And it also supported my interpretation of the findings with a possibility to easily find comments that I had made in the interviews or when I was transcribing. First, I conducted my data into one mind map for each interview, and then reread, reanalyzed it until I almost could say it. If you pushed my button in the middle of the night, I would have been able to read it out loud. In the second phase of the analysis process, I reflected on if there was possible to perceive some themes. And from this, I developed, first of all, 9 initial themes. And this is an example of a mind map with material from one of the 9 initial themes. Yeah, and you can see the color of every participant, and it's taken all the way. And sometimes it ends up like this, because this is working mind map when I was trying to find categories to one of the 4 main themes that I decided to use. And you can see the color following all the way through. There's a lot of subcategories in this, categories in this. It turned out a little bit easier later, but it's just to give you a picture of how it looked like when I was working with it. It's pretty big. Yeah. I ended up with 4 central themes and these categories in which I found that I could describe how the findings could answer my research question. A theme of how solution-focused approach was used in supervision, something about the supervisory relationship, something about the role of solution-focused supervision, and the content of solution-focused supervision. This mind map is a little bit easier to work with because that is the next step. It illustrates how I use them to get an overview of the content of the data in one of the central themes, in this case, the supervisory relationship. And the last phase, as I said before, was to find some of the extracts that I could use actively. And all the things that are stated here is actually words from my participants. I haven't written any of that. It's all words from the participants. Their words. Okay. The findings showed a way of doing supervision, focusing on what worked, on strength, on skills and resources. The participants described how their supervisors used the solution-focused approach of leading from one step behind, one of Into Kim Berg's very fine ways of describing a solution-focused approach, and how that was helpful for them. The usefulness of getting compliments and celebrating both the counselors' and the client's successes was evident, and seen in both the way they described what they took away from solution-focused supervision and how they emphasized the importance of validation and affirmation in the supervisory relationship. Sharing and celebrating successes seemed to have the effect of strengthening their confidence and maintaining their professional identity. It is remarkable to see how they, as highly experienced counselors, described the feeling of being more hopeful, taking away useful ideas for their client work, and some of them even said that they were more happy and a lot more energized when they left that supervision. My findings showed a very significant experience of a positive supervisory relationship in the participating counselors' solution-focused supervision. Role modeling of the supervisor's behavior, attitude, and values seemingly affected the supervisee's own way of doing their professional practice. The participants had chosen their supervisor based on a range of different motives, mainly based on their workload or on more personal needs or preferred style, and the choice of supervisors seemed to be an essential element in establishing a good supervisory relationship. A facet in the findings which especially surprised me, because of their extensive experience, was their vision of the supervisor as a person they wished to develop to be like, both professionally and personally. And I've sometimes thought, well, I think you've accomplished that actually, but yeah. The findings showed a supervisory relationship based on the supervisee's reality, their situation, and their way of seeing the world, and how the solution-focused supervision functioned as a professional conversation. The solution-focused supervisor's support seemed to stretch beyond mentoring, and they took a personal interest in the supervisee's professional development, fostering a clear collaborative working alliance. The participants described their solution-focused supervisors as an opportunity, or the solution-focused supervision, as an opportunity to reflect, talk things through, and bounce their thoughts. The need for support and encouragement, a feeling of being understood and affirmed, seemed to be connected to this positive supervisory relationship. They mentioned how the supervisor had energy, enthusiasm, and hope, which could demonstrate an effect of using a solution-focused approach. I found it noticeable that the participants described how they experienced the experiences that they had in the solution-focused supervision, how that was transferred to their work with clients and colleagues, and that they experienced an effect not only on their own work, but actually on the client's outcome. A pilot study has actually shown this positive client outcome of solution-focused supervision, but I guess we have to do more research to actually be acknowledged for that. The participants described a sense of having a mentor and even a muse. Love that word, muse. Who of you who is supervisors wouldn't like to be a muse? It's kind of wonderful. Which proposed that solution-focused supervision actually seem to support their professional growth and learning. Two of the participants mentioned that they saw their solution-focused supervisor as their cheerleader. A very wonderful description of how solution-focused supervision was useful for them, I think. They don't seem to be the only ones. Somebody else in solution-focused research have actually found the same. So cheerleading might be a good thing to do if you're a supervisor. Finally, the findings of this study suggest that solution-focused supervision largely can fulfill the participating experienced counselors' needs and expectations for clinical supervision. The fundamental assumptions from the solution-focused approach were clearly integrated and implemented in this kind of counseling supervision. It was shown how solution-focused supervision functioned as a professional conversation, and that the supervisor worked more as a consultant. In this study, a solution-focused approach used in clinical supervision seemed to inherit a very warm and positive supervisory relationship built on mutual respect, a collaborative intention between the counselor and the solution-focused supervisor to achieve a good outcome for the client, and the best possible counseling practice, and also showed clearly how they share the responsibility to reach those goals. The participating, extremely experienced counselors showed agency in their use of solution-focused supervision, highlighting the collaborative working alliance, and especially the focus on their own goals for supervision. My studies showed how the participating counselors felt supported, both as professionals and as persons. Quite important element, I think. The participants described solution-focused supervision as their most influential professional development when they compared it to training activities and courses. And one of my personal interests in this, and a very fine connection to some of the things that we were talking about before lunch, it does actually suggest that solution-focused supervision might be a useful tool to prevent burnout and support a balanced life as a counselor by emphasizing the importance of the individual awareness on stress management and self-care. Yeah, that's where we started, wasn't it? Yeah, that's my...
Kia ora, namaste everyone. Yeah. And thank you for your kind attention, and thank you, Shani, for providing a rather light lunch. Nobody's sleepy now. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was talking with Bob a little earlier, and he made a very nice comment that I think I should start with. Yeah, because I am Judy Miller's last PhD student ever, and he said that, yeah. Okay, I would like to believe that I'm the last. Okay. And Bob said, "Oh, you're Judy's last hurrah, but you also brought her down. Look what you've done." So, thank you, Judy, and sorry. All right. Okay, so yes, so a little bit different from solution focused now. I'm going to talk a bit about person-centered, and at the start, I would like to clarify why I did a mindfulness-infused person-centered is because I think after I did my master's, I learned mindfulness as well. And so I'm from India, and we had this organization that is like the equivalent of Youthline back there, and they used to do a mindfulness approach with suicidal clients. And so I learned mindfulness with them, and that's when I realized that there's this huge impact of mindfulness and active listening. So that's when I decided to, with my clients, kind of suture the process together and see how it works. And I started getting some good feedback, and and especially working with young people between like 18 to 30, they started appreciating the process more. So I said, okay, let's take a leap of faith. Let's make a PhD out of this. Okay, so that's when that was the method. And again, when I first started my PhD, I was offered the opportunity to work with a group like me whose home was not New Zealand. And I decided to go with refugees, mainly because I was very interested in the lived experience of forced migration. Yep. And yeah, I'll explain how I chose Bhutan later. Yep. So yes, I do want to start, rather than bore you with the method, I will talk about the Lot Shampas. The Lot Shampas are basically the Bhutanese. That was the word given to them. So this map will hopefully make it a little clearer. So there you have India and you have Bhutan, cozy in the nook of India, and Nepal. So basically what Lot Shampa means, it means someone who was from Bhutan but originated in Nepal. Okay? So all the people who I worked with in my research had ancestors in Nepal who they were then taken to Bhutan either for land cultivation or for construction of stupas or monuments, and then they lived there and became citizens there. Okay, and like I said, I'm from India, and India has played a very crucial role in the refugee crisis of both these countries, because as you can see, we are literally thrust in the middle of both of them. So the people from Bhutan have had to trek through India to go back to Nepal. Okay, and so this will probably make it a little clearer. So what Lot Shampa literally means, so that is the political meaning, but the literal meaning of Lot Shampa is person of the south. So all the people who migrated from Nepal used to occupy the southern part, and they became the primary food producers of Bhutan. And somewhere in 1958 that's when the House of Bhutan at that time decided to give them citizenship and make them legal immigrants. But in the 1980s, the new government realized that they are being threatened, that the Nepalis are taking over, and basically it was a religious thing because Nepal is primarily Hindu, whereas Bhutan is primarily Buddhist. And they realized that the Hindu traditions, the Hindu dresses, the Hindu culture is taking over, and that's when they made a horrifying decision to revoke the previous Citizenship Act, and this was 1985, for ethnic nationalism, that's what it's called. They revoked the Citizenship Act and they withdrew the citizenship rights of all the Bhutanese who had been there since the 17th century, and tens of thousands of people were rendered citizenless and homeless. Okay, so yeah, these are just some of the facts that I have said already. And basically, yes, when you say what people say about ethnic nationalism, it is racism but without a racist component to it. Yeah, so you're literally made homeless in your own country, such that you end up choosing to leave because you can't do anything. Yeah, the government of Bhutan even banned the Nepali dress, the Nepali language. They were not even allowed to speak their own language in public. Yeah, and they were left with ultimately no choice but to flee. And if you remember the previous map, I will just go to. Yes, so the first thing that they did is they fled to India because that was the closest thing. But India, as you know, already has a huge population, and the Indian government said, no, you can't come here. So then they went back to Nepal, to their roots. And the king of Nepal said, that's not fair. You guys have been away for generations. You're not our problem. Please go. And that's when the UNHCR intervened and they set up these. So these are actual pictures of the refugee camp. They set up these right at the border of Nepal. Yeah, so they set them up there hoping that they would get a solution. Yeah, so in the meantime, the people, tens of thousands of people were just put there. And yeah, around 80,000 people were living in this confined space by 1992. Okay, and in fact, the UNHCR tried to broker the situation for a long time, and the solution was only reached in 2007 when New Zealand came to the rescue, and New Zealand decided to repatriate, was the first country to repatriate the Bhutanese, and that's how in 2007 they signed the memorandum, and in 2008 that's when the first Bhutanese arrived in New Zealand. So at the time that I started my PhD, the Bhutanese were actually the newest refugee community. Yeah, in 2016 with the Syrians arrived. So that became something valuable for me as well. There was absolutely no research done on no, I shouldn't say absolutely. There was not enough done on the needs of the Bhutanese community. There was not enough understanding about the Bhutanese community, and I had a unique position that I have a shared culture, a shared language, and I decided to use that and my skills as a counselor and see what we come up with. Yeah. So my thesis, as you can imagine, was very, very, very vast, and I had three main research questions or objectives. The first being to understand the lived experiences of the refugee youth. Yeah, that's why I opted for a phenomenological approach to study what was their lived experience of being a refugee. Then I also wanted to explore what was the lived experience of coping for them. How did they cope with whatever life threw at them? And finally, I offered mindfulness-infused, person-centered counseling sessions to them, and then tried to explore if that boosted their coping, made them cope better, or what. So all I knew is that that's going in there somehow. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so this is just to give you a bit of an overview of how the data collection went. So there were 3 parts to it, and yeah, it looks very simple, but it's spread out for at least 12 months because there was at least 1 to 2 weeks gap between part 1 and part 2, and then part 2 took about 5 to 6 weeks, and then there had to be up to 7 weeks gap between part 2 and part 3. Okay. Yeah, I will only talk about part 2 for now. So basically, like I said, there were 5 sessions offered to them, and they were 60 minutes each. And we spent the first 10 minutes of the session learning mindfulness. Usually it would be me guiding them in a guided meditation to center their attention. And the last 5 minutes again was spent in mindfulness. And that served to bring their attention out of all what they had been talking. And it's also worthwhile to mention here that all my participants were volunteers, and they come from a culture like mine where nobody knows what counseling is. So I did try explaining to them, with information sheets and all. So finally, they decided to come into counseling only for one reason, and that is curiosity. They did not know what it is, but they said, okay, we want to come along firsthand and see what exactly it is you're doing. And yes, some of them actually entered and looked for the couch. Yeah. Okay. So, yes, so I need to mention that there was no analysis as such taken of the counseling, because that, as you saw, that was not my goal, to analyze the counseling. We were analyzing the outcomes. But what you see up here is what I extracted as, because I had to undergo counseling supervision as well, and I had to extract my reflections, yeah, and these themes then were extracted from the reflections. So this is not exactly an analysis, it's a reflection, okay, and okay, so I'm just gonna, so as you can see, these are the prominent emotions that were presented within the sessions. And why I have used pictures of children is because all my participants did not experience the flight from Bhutan into Nepal. They were all born in Nepal. So the story of flight they've only heard from their parents. So when they came to New Zealand, they were children. And a lot of the content of their session focused upon childhood memories. And the first one was powerlessness, and that was one of the overriding emotions that was presented every time. And primarily it is because they kept having their space invaded. They were young, living in the refugee camp with no resources, not enough food, not enough water, no security, and at the same time, they were young, they could not fix it at all. So that's where the powerlessness stems from. And it is my belief that their frustration actually came from their powerlessness, because they could not fight what was happening. And one of my participants captured it well when she said, "We were just leaves in the wind. There was absolutely nothing we could do. We were attacked, our houses were set on fire, but there we were." Yeah? And with the frustration also there is anger, because some people express powerlessness that even when their families were offered to repatriate to New Zealand, most of them did not have a choice. They were just told, "Here is your bag, here are your papers, follow your parents, go." And there comes the anger, because they felt that there was no agency. They felt that they were not involved in such a huge decision. And interestingly, many of my clients actually said that now, as young adults, this is the first time they're actually talking about it. Because, culturally speaking, you don't question your parents, and that action of their parents of taking them out, even without asking them, was perceived as protecting them. So they never spoke with it about their parents. They've actually kept it to themselves and spoke about it now years later in counseling. And the very interesting finding, or at least for me, was that powerless, frustration, and anger are themes that are presented very commonly in New Zealand among youth who don't have refugee backgrounds as well. So, of course, I have to acknowledge that it is for different reasons. So, but the takeaway here is that the feelings and the stories, okay, not stories, but the needs, the psychological needs and mental health needs of refugee youth are not that drastically different from people who don't have refugee backgrounds. And that was a huge eye-opener for me. But one emotion additionally they had was grief. Yeah? And I haven't written it there, but along with their grief, they had a lot of guilt sutured in as well. And grief was basically because they spoke about how they didn't like the camp. They didn't like their lives in the camp. It was dirty and all those things. But when they were finally removed from their camp and brought to New Zealand, they realized they've lost everything. That was the only home they knew, the only families they knew, the only houses they knew, and the only friends they had, and they realized it's gone. They were just plucked out because not everyone got to come to New Zealand. Some had to go to other countries, some had to stay in the camp. So that grief of separation was one of the emotions that my participants said, and even the literature has acknowledged that grief is actually one of the overriding emotions in the counseling sessions of refugees in general, primarily owing to the loss. And I noticed few tingles of guilt as well, because again, guilt because they felt that they weren't able to help. So on one hand, there was anger that why am I not being involved? And on the other hand, there was guilt of that, oh God, my parents are doing everything and I can't help. So there were all these things coming up in the sessions. Okay, and yeah, before I jump to this, as I said in the beginning, that I offered mindfulness and counseling as one. They were not two separate sessions for the whole thing. But for the sake of my thesis, I kind of had to disentangle both of them for writing up. I had to write the perceived benefits of mindfulness in one place and the perceived benefits of counseling in another place. And that's what I'm doing here as well, because the participants felt that way too. They felt that the mindfulness did something for them, or some felt that the counseling was more beneficial. So that is why I'm presenting it here, not because it was something separate. So these are some of the, again, the overriding themes that came out from my analysis of the mindfulness intervention. So a lot of my participants reported that that mindfulness made them appreciate the forest more. And this comes because a lot of people who live in New Zealand love going trekking, love going hiking, and they felt that now, after practicing mindfulness and even practicing it outside their sessions, there is a deep sense of connection with the environment. And as some of them felt that now every time they go into a forest, or go into a place of hiking, there is a sense of connection with the ground. There's also a sense of gratitude to the forest. And again, forest is a word that they used quite a lot because the refugee camp in Nepal is actually bordered by a forest. So I know that the people in New Zealand may not always use the word forest, but yeah, this I have extracted from them. And while appreciating this environment, they even appreciated the forest back home. They were thankful to the forest for looking after them and protecting them and feeding them. Another benefit that they reported was that they were able to find solutions through quiet meditation. Again, I've put the word meditation in brackets up there because it's a word that they used, because according to them, there was not a lot of difference between mindfulness and meditation. So every time they spoke about it, they just referred to it as meditation. So basically, they found that they were able to connect with solutions once they connected with the calm within. Okay, and yes, in all these situations, the ones that are here and the ones that are about to come up, all these clients reported practicing mindfulness outside the sessions, at home or wherever they needed. So these are not necessarily things that came up in the session, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. Dealing with the bad stuff. As I said earlier, a lot of them felt that, those emotions, this was the first opportunity they had to verbalize them and actually deal with them. So this is what they felt, that the mindfulness actually made them calm enough to do it. And they were thankful for that because they felt that, they have never been able to do it, and maybe because they are always too busy trying to run from one thing to another and early in their lives, they were just trying to stay alive. And so they felt that now learning to stay calm, learning how to be calm in the middle of everything is actually helping them to deal with some of these emotions. And finally, this was something that appeared across all my participants. All of them said that after practicing mindfulness, we were able to forgive those who betrayed us, forgive those who hurt us. And it seems very spiritual. Yeah, I guarantee you I was not teaching them how to pray, but this was something that all of them said, that in the quiet of their hearts now, they were able to reach that place of forgiveness, even though they could not for many years. And just to continue with that, okay, so all that I have shown you up to date has all been the words of the participants. And the interesting thing is that all these things that they reported are actually also found by other researchers in the literature, but they are called by different words. So appreciating the forest is called connectedness with nature. Basically, what connectedness means, having more depth. And again, it's been demonstrated a lot in mindfulness interventions, and it was demonstrated here as well. Being able to find quiet solutions is referred to in mindfulness literature as accessing inherent wisdom. The wisdom is already there. The solutions are already there in their minds. It's just that it's clouded over, and because of their stress, they're not able to access that. Whereas here, with mindfulness, many of them reported that the clouds cleared, and finally, they were able to reach the solution. Well, releasing unhealthy emotions, that's pretty straightforward. Yeah. And finally, you have acceptance and forgiveness. Okay, and this is a very interesting, it's very spiritual in its, even the theory. But basically, I was also very curious about this when I'm like, how can meditation help you forgive? But you have the writings of this one Buddhist monk, Pema Chodron, and she says that when you practice mindfulness, somehow you become very gentle with yourself, and you are able to be very kind to yourself and accept yourself and your circumstances. And when you reach that level of kindness with yourself, you're able to extend it to others in the form of empathy and forgiveness. And it's very interesting because, and I was very fascinated by this because in the sessions, a lot of my participants actually said that we can never, we are still so angry with all those people who betrayed us, because a lot of the Bhutanese people who were living in the refugee camps actually had to turn traitor, and they actually sold off their own people. And so initially when they came into counseling, they expressed this anger that how could they have done that? How could they have done that to us? But after learning this, after mindfulness and after getting it out, all of them said, now we understand why. They had to survive just like we did. And so, and they were understanding, they were making an effort to understand the people who hurt them rather than judge them. And they said, now we can accept the way things have gone. Yeah. And I referred to it in the previous slide as reflections of mindfulness, but the literature calls them metacognitions, or byproducts, if you will. Okay, is someone keeping track of time? How are we going? Okay. So, yes, now I'll just be a little critical and go to the strengths and limitations of this method. And I was just remembering what Professor Frank said earlier this morning. Sometimes we tend to exaggerate the outcomes of our therapy. Maybe. Or not. But so I'm going to present both what I thought was good and what I think needs to be viewed critically, and you decide. So the first strength, obviously, is that the person-centered approach. Researchers often feel that a person-centered approach is a very valuable human resource, and that needs to be explored further. And in this situation, I found that it was exactly what was needed, because in person-centered counseling, the clients steer their own sessions. So I did not have to tell them what to talk about. They came up with all of that on their own, and I think, and from their reports, they said that this is what they wanted. They didn't need anyone to fix them. Just listen to them, support them. Yeah. And mindfulness approach, and again, this comes something from what the participants kept saying. It was very easy to learn, easy to practice, something that they could take away with them. Yeah, because there's no special equipment or experience that is required to learn this. Yeah. And some of the limitations, the critique of my method, first and foremost was my dual role as a counselor and researcher, because I'd like to believe that by the end of my thesis, they all liked me very much and didn't want to hurt my feelings. So that could have been a limiting factor in giving me any negative feedback. We did kind of explore what if we got a research assistant to do those interviews instead, and it was too much of an ethical drama, so that had to be dropped. Yeah, so that is something that I acknowledge. And again, like I said, there were about 5 to 7 weeks gap in between the final counseling session and the interview that measured the outcomes. And none of them reported any adverse event in those 7 weeks. So it cannot be safely determined that if there is another adverse event, like another resettlement, or in this case, the earthquakes, yeah, will they cope better when that happens? Okay. And again, finally, client expectations, as people have already said, do affect the engagement in these sessions. And my clients did not report any expectations. Okay, so maybe future research needs to delve into that a little better in other ways and see where it comes up. And it's interesting, one of the previous presenters actually came up and said, I didn't know where my data was going. Yeah, I was there with all this and I didn't know where it was going. Oh, I knew where I wanted to go, but when I reached there, I realized that my participants steered me in a different direction. Okay, so where you saw anger, frustration, and grief, I was intending to find earthquake shock, trauma from resettlement, sadness at being separated, and I didn't find any of that. Yeah, that's where I entered in thinking that I would be everyone's Superman, but I found out after any research that they really don't need to be saved. Yeah, and I'm glad that using the person-centered approach, I was able to give them what they wanted, just to be listened, to be heard. Yeah, and yes, then I will, just a few implications. Yeah, I've already spoken about the first thing, and the value of person-centered counselling, and especially it's important now that New Zealand is moving towards increasing its annual refugee intake and opening up more cities further than Christchurch where refugees can live in, and trying to follow Australia's model of offering adjustment interventions, that this is a very important finding for those people. Yeah? The value of person-centered counselling and its literal cost effectiveness. And for researchers, I think, just like me, people need to learn not to make assumptions of what refugees might be in need of. Yeah? They have massive, we need to always acknowledge that they've been through a lot and they've gotten through it without our help. And in fact, in one of the sessions, one of my clients actually commented, she's like, people think that we were scared of the earthquakes, and she's like, no, we were not, because what we've experienced in our past is worse than 10 earthquakes put together. Yeah? And another hopeful implication is, or thing to consider, is that the needs of the refugee background youth are not drastically different from youth who don't have refugee backgrounds. And that's very hopeful in doing research for them, because as David Blackwell often says, very often when we work with refugees, we often look for theories that will support the hurt person phenomenon, and we're looking for theories that will help us fix them, but actually that's not the case. Okay, and in fact, that's what most of the refugee youth, at least in Christchurch, that's what they want. They want to not be treated differently. They want to not be constantly reminded that they were refugees. Yeah. And with that, thank you. Namaste.
When Shani said, we would like to do this, I jumped from what I usually do. So in case you don't know, I'm quite nervous about this because this is way out of my sort of comfort zone for what I would normally do. Just, that's getting the empathy going. Isn't it? Did you get it? Yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah. Okay, so anyway, this has been, one of the themes today I think has been that if you've got an interest in an area, then you should go for that as your sort of research topic. In this case, what's happening is, those of you who don't know or do know, that we're having to move from this site, and so we're having to get rid of a whole lot of documents, anything that's paper, books, So come to my office if you want to check out some of my books, because I can't take them with me. And so I sort of thought, well, what about all this data that we've got on our students? Can we just sort of put it in a place where it, collates or makes a bit more sense? And so some of our graduates already know this, that in the second year, they have to do about 300 hours of face-to-face counselling. So it's not like the first year when they're sort of practicing this new model of working. It actually is working with real clients in a real agency, if you like, real, whatever that might mean. And at the end of it, we ask them, during it, we actually ask them to log what they're doing. There's another sort of plan of that, is hopefully you'll do this more. You'll start it as an exercise for our program, but you'll continue it on, and it'll be something like what Frank's saying about evaluating my practice, knowing about, the gender, have I got a breadth here, am I sticking to the same, am I being just comfortable, or whatever. So there's sort of other reasons for it, but anyway, so they set up these set of tables in which they sort of talk about the range, they talk about the issues that the clients come with, and they talk about how many sessions they might have. And all I thought I'd do today is just pull out some of the data from that. I mean, we do teach a brief model of counselling, so one of the interesting things is, are actually our students working in a brief way? I'm sort of smiling over there because Bob and I used to work together and we used to try and get brief, and we've talked about it a lot in terms of there's quite a lot of research out there. Frank was talking about it before, about, change needs sort of has to, on the whole, needs to happen in the first 7 sessions and then it sort of flattens off. So that's a model of brief. perhaps we should stop after 7 and we should give a break and then come back, or, you know, there's other ways of working like this. But anyway, so that was one of the things. And the other was we do have a need to talk about content, not just about techniques. We do quite a lot of reflective and reflexive exercises with our students so that they can, the person of the counsellor is acknowledged. But it'd be just interesting to see whether the things that they're facing out in these placements are actually what we're teaching. So that was another sort of, motivation for doing this. So, I've kept most of that data. It's in a filing cabinet, which I won't be able to take any further, so that's why I thought it might be quite useful. Anyway, about 2 minutes ago, I had a look at the first slide and I realised that, I've done it incorrectly, so I'm just going to go past. Oh, no, actually, I did do the slides, and I want to thank Neville for, he actually did the dog work, if you like. That's what happens when you supervise a PhD student, you're allowed to. No, there was money transferred, wasn't there? I think there was. Yeah. I think. Corruption. And so he just got together with all that data and sort of put it together. And I could do it as numbers, but I've just decided to go with sort of bar charts. So that's why I'm saying I'm completely out of my depth here. And of course, the first one I realised is absolutely wrong, so I'm just going to go through that very quickly. Oops. And past that one, because it's actually exactly the same as this one for some reason. Anyway, so 2012-13 was sort of a transition year. And, you can read them, can you? Yes. Sort of, right. So the way that all the data gets together, comes as a sort of the most common, the most mentioned by these students in terms of the things that they were working with. 2012, it's an interesting year for us, isn't it? So is it surprising that anxiety might be the thing that is mentioned the most? Probably not, right? And actually, this anger, family issues, relationships, I mean, what Neville was saying about before, they're here, regardless of the fact that these people are not necessarily refugees. So that's 2013, 2014. I'm not going to even explain it to you, but you can just sort of see there's subtle differences, but there's similar things coming up all the time. Maybe I should mention, I probably mention it in a slide later, but a lot of these students are out in the community. Some of them are in schools, so you might find relationship issues stronger there, but some of them were in prisons, other community agencies, and that hasn't been broken down in this. So we're sort of looking at a gross measure of the sorts of things that come up, and I'm sure that the counselling, the counsellors in here are probably all nodding, and saying, yep, I could probably map myself onto this. So did it change? Only a little. You can see the numbers of people in the course changed a little bit, but that doesn't change it too much. So you look back when you're doing this, don't you? You sort of think, well, I could have asked them all to use the same definitions, because some of them are now calling this thing family issues and this thing relationships. And I bet the people in last year that called it relationship probably had family in there as well. So that's just the nature of, I'd really like to talk to them rather than do the numbers, but that's just the way it is. Okay. 2016, relationship anxiety, still pretty high. Little interesting thing about 2016, it's about it's the beginning of this suicidal, I think there was a little bit in 2013, yep. And substance abuse is starting to sort of creep in. So I think that's quite interesting. And then last year, self-harm, the suicidal school issues and things like that. But, and the one that I think is quite interesting here is bullying coming up as something that students are actually really talking about. So, I could just, any comments perhaps before I go on to the slide about what you notice, what you...
Wouldn't it be interesting if you could see a similar
Yeah. Whether that anxiety is still there. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing with anxiety, of course, is that some of the students would say it's what we might call school issues. So it's actually probably a neoliberal sort of anxiety, which is I have to do well at school. I have to, perform well and stuff like that. So yes, some of it is definitely, about the earthquakes, I would think. But yeah, so yeah, some interesting stuff there. Yep.
Just commenting there, because I've worked in local in the school for 30 years.
Yeah.
My data in the last 3 years, like family relationships are all, because family issues are kind of like anxiety and depression.
Yeah, so it's all links
About 16,
pretty well.
I think in the last 2 years, about 16% of the conversations I have with that anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah, just as a context.
So what did we, so one of the things I looked at after I'd sort of put this together, apart from the fact that I can't do graphs, that's, the thing, is that, students did use their own definitions for how they describe those things. I'm not worried about that. It just makes it a little bit difficult for trying to do a comparative thing. But, I mean, we've talked a lot today about meanings, meaning making and stuff. So in a way, it's a bit irrelevant. It's like, I've got a rain gauge up at our little forest up the road there, and it's a really pathetic rain gauge, and everybody tells me how pathetic it is. But, I can look at the rain from last year and this year, and I'm using the same gauge, so I think I can get something out of it, even though it might not be accurate as such. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, and I suppose what I noticed, and probably if I had more time and I could get actually the numbers, that range in there might be, as interesting, because I just pulled out one example. Looking at anxiety, one student worked with 35 students who had anxiety issues during that year, whereas another one worked with 160. So, we're getting a table that has both of those in there. One might be balancing the other, so I guess that is a limitation. And it doesn't indicate, as I said, the difference in placements. So anyway, I thought it was sort of interesting. Yep. And probably these are no surprises. That's probably about the ranking that we've got. Not necessarily in that order, but those would be the top 5 that are coming up for our students and for the counselling community, not just our students, but for counsellors. So relationships issues, anxiety, depression, grief, and recently something about self-harm. We've definitely got quite a lot of that going on in the schools, and it's probably happening in other places as well. So let's have a look at, what are we teaching on this course, and, are we sort of on the right track? Well, the first thing is that a lot of people have talked about solution-focused counselling today, and I think by the time the students are doing this year, the second year, we've already talked about it being integrated. So in the first year, we ask our students to be pure solution-focused counsellors, because if you don't try it out, you can't see whether it fits or not, So you've got to actually do it, and we'll be assessing you on that. The following year, we're actually saying, yeah, but you can bring in some other things, because actually it's the client that's going to make the decision as to whether this is the best thing, not you. The thing about having anything to do with relationships is that relationship basis is what solution focused is, and so there's a lot of questioning of clients about who else would notice, what else, who else is important in your life, and all of that about those relationships is coming up really early in the work. So I sort of feel like, well, if relationships is what a lot of people are coming to counselling for, then I think that this course is helping the counsellors work in a way that would be meeting the needs of those clients. And we've also got content that we put into the program. We look at anxiety, we look at depression, and we look at grief counselling. So hopefully, we're actually covering so the students are not going into a placement feeling ill-equipped. It's not. I mean, we don't give them everything by any means. We introduce them and enable them to sort of take it further. so that they don't feel anxious about, suddenly I've got this client with an issue that I've never thought about before. So hopefully we have got that. And the bullying and working on assessing risk is there. So I sort of felt okay when I looked at that and thought about what we're doing and what the students are coming out with. So the second thing was, how brief is the work of our students? And again, let me just see whether I've done my tables right or not. So this time, what I've got is actually the number of the counsellors, how many there are, and, the one that would have the most, sessions. So down here is the sessions and down there is the counsellors. So, we've got, down to about here is a few of them five sessions, and then above that would be 10. But that's the most that they're having, the sort of the 10. And again, remember that we've got our students in a number of places now. It was a number of years ago that we decided to take our students out of a particular counselling centre because it was actually using WINS money to be the funder for the clients, and the WINS money was for 6 months. So it was a predetermined time that you were going to be in counselling. And so our students were really already disadvantaged if they said, well, what say the client doesn't need that, or, whatever. So, so this is quite positive, I think, and I'll just flip through the other years. You can see 2013. Again, I don't need to sort of put these out. I'll just, different number of students and different number of times that they're actually, number of sessions they're having with clients. 2015, makes it a bit difficult when they're fatter, it just makes us look like there's something else going on. Nadia. So I'm just going to, make a summary at the end of all of this, right? So when I looked at that data, I looked over those 6 years. We had a total of 58 students. And of that total 58, 46 of them conducted their counselling in 5 or fewer counselling sessions. And even I can work that out to be 82%, so I think that's pretty good. There's lots of numbers in there for me. And then I thought, well, okay, let's just have a look at 4, try and come down from 5, because that's 5 or less. And so I just looked at the last 3 years. 70% of our students have conducted their counselling in fewer than 4 sessions. So, you might say, well, it's being forced because of the course. Of course, that might be the case. They might think they're being assessed on it, but actually, this is not one of the requirements of the course. It's not like you'll fail if you demonstrate that you're having longer with clients. So, I feel quite encouraged by that sort of gross data. Jeepers, this was last night, I think I thought of this. How could I make a sort of a summary of it? A number of our students are introduced to the idea of a 3-legged learning stool, and hopefully there's a few nods going on from everybody. That is, what are the things that provide you with a knowledge base? One is research and theory, so we've actually got a number of things today. I've been a little bit about that. One is that personal life, and that's coming more and more to the front of, a lot of what was talked about today is actually it's about the person, it's about the counsellor as much as anything else. And the other is practice, and I guess I was just looking at practice at this stage. I was just taking one leg out of there. But one of the things we do at the end of that year is we ask students to sort of write a little bit about, over these last 2 years, what's been the most helpful thing in terms of your development as a counsellor. And invariably they will say the placement. And so, it's just an interest, a curiosity that I've got, that if they're getting in there, they're seeing the real clients, they're working with the issues that we are helping to introduce them to, they're feeling confident in those places, then and they're getting a lot out of that placement, then it's sort of like a really nice match. And it seems like, well, I've just said that. And as I said before, I hope that what we've done in setting up this way of sort of taking a log is that it's something that to be continued, because I think there's heaps of information in there for each individual counsellor. I mean, they can take it beyond that, they can share it with other people, they can take it to a supervisor, they can sort of look at it and say, well, you know, it seems like I'm getting more and more clients, you know, that are coming in with this. What can I do about that? What professional development should I do? What extra, you know, help do I need? And so not just being haphazard, oh, so-and-so's here, I can see this looks like a really good course, maybe I should go. But actually, I'm just seeing this with the clients, and it would be really useful for me to find a way of strengthening that part. Is that it? Oh yeah, that's just the jeepers. Did I do that? Yeah. So I'm open to questions.